It's time now for The Clash, in which we tackle a major topic of the day from opposing points of view. Tonight, should the £20 weekly universal credit uplift continue indefinitely? Or do the challenges facing our economy and the nation's finances speak for its reversal and a dose of fiscal prudence? With me to debate this question, I'm delighted to welcome four luminaries on this topic. Joe VENTRE, who is a digital campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. ALFIE Sterling, an old friend of mine, chief economist at the New Economics Foundation. Steve McCabe, Labour MP for Birmingham, Selly and a member of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. And last but not least, ANNABEL, Head of Communications at the IEA. Brilliant to have you all on board. Let me start with you, if I can. Joe, what's your view? £20 is not a lot of money, and it makes a big difference to many people.
It certainly is a lot of money to people that are struggling at the moment. But I think, the universal credit uplift is one of a number of measures brought in to tackle the economic fallout from this pandemic, alongside things like the furlough scheme. And I think, although we knew at the time that this would be a costly move for the public finances, I think the decisions taken by the government were justifiable in the face of, what was an emergency. But we always knew that these measures, like the lockdown measures themselves, had to be temporary. And I think there had to be a point where things returned to normal. And you fast forward to today, and as the economy is starting to get moving again, I think now is the time for a managed return to normal. But I think it's absolutely right at the same time that we think about how we protect the poorest in our society. But to do that sustainably and realistically, we're going to need growth. And my concern is that extending this uplift will only hinder that growth, making things worse in the long run.
Steve McCabe, Labour MP for Birmingham, Selly and member of the Work and Pension Select Committee. Welcome to the programme. What's your view on this?
Well, I think it's a kind of high-risk strategy at the time when the economy is still trying to recover from COVID, and about, 1.4 million people are just coming off furlough. I mean, we know that the number of people dependent on universal credit has doubled. We know that people are very dependent on this money, and I think it risks actually, contrary to Joe's view, I think this risks actually putting pressure on the economy instead of encouraging growth. People simply won't have enough money to spend, and they won't have enough money to spend in some of the poorest parts of the country. I think it is not designed to help things move along. I think it's actually designed to plunge people into poverty.
I mean, Steve, the issue we've got, I can't imagine too many people would reject the idea that the poorest in our society should receive an extra £20. As I said at the beginning, it's, in relative terms, especially what's been spent in the pandemic, not a huge amount of money, but it does make a huge difference to many families. The issue we've got, of course, is £2 trillion worth of debt. I mean, this uptick, it doesn't come out of economic growth, does it? It comes out of borrowing.
It absolutely does, and I accept that. But, I mean, if the government's agenda is about levelling up, you don't level up by making the poorest poorer. That seems to me self-evident. And if you can afford to spend £9 billion on non-tender contracts going to dubious people, then I think you can afford the money to keep the poorest in food and in heat and in accommodation. I don't really think, there are umpteen things that could be reviewed if we want to look at government spending. We need to know about whether or not we really need royal yachts, for example, how many other vanity projects the Prime Minister has in mind. If you're really concerned about that, then we should be looking at that. But actually, this is a measure that will simply make the poorest poorer.
Well, Steve, I think that the idea of a royal yacht is a bit of a low blow. That's a few million, that's small change compared to the billions we're talking about. But I'll come back to you.
Yes, but it's whether or not it's necessary, surely. It may be small change, but actually all the small change items that are having money wasted on them at a time when we're supposed to be focusing our priorities are a reasonable place to start.
Well, I do agree with you about the colossal amount of money that has been wasted in the course of the pandemic. With us also is ANNABEL, Head of Communications at the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hi, Annabelle. What's your view on the uptick?
Oh, hi, Mark. If I first may just respond to a couple of things that Steve said there. First, the idea that we should pay people more, or government should pay people more either through benefits or perhaps increasing the wages of public sector workers in order that they may spend more in the economy and get it going that way. I mean, the trouble with that is that why not make it a £50 a week uplift? Where's the ceiling if that's the logic behind it? And the second point I'd make is the idea that we've spent 9 billion on one thing, so we've got the money to spend 9 million or however much it would cost to spend on something else is completely wrong. Government spending is a zero-sum game. If you have household finances and you've got £1,000 in your bank account and you spend £1,000, that's £1,000 less that you have to spend on something else, not £1,000 more. But what I do agree with Steve is that we should look at ways that the government can cut spending. And we're just not hearing anything about that. No real sort of meaningful look or serious look at how we can meaningfully cut government spending. And to your question on the universal credit uplift, I agree with Joe that this should be coming to an end at the end of this month. It's never easy to set the levels for benefits. I wouldn't like to live on the minimum, and nor would anybody else. And there is always a case for more. But we need to remember that this uplift, which was announced in the March 2020 budget, was designed to protect people who face serious short-run disruption to living standards as they unexpectedly became unemployed or had their working hours sharply reduced. And yet, millions of Brits, more than usual, started applying for universal credit, and we needed to foot the bill for that. And I think that was understandable. But those on long-term universal credit didn't face that problem, and they received the extra money anyway. And there's just simply not a case now for continuing it. We are recovering. We need to cut the furlough scheme, as Joe said. We need to cancel the universal credit uplift, and we need to allow the economy to get going again. And I'm sure we'll come on to how we do that later.
Alfie Sterling, Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation. There was widespread sort of support for this uptick. It was pretty much a cross-party consensus, but the country's broke, so it's got to stop.
Yeah, and we've got cross-party support for keeping it in place as well. That's right across all the major political parties in England supporting it, including Conservative backbenchers. I do think it's really important to just set out some really basic economics in this conversation, though, because both Joe and Annabelle talked about cutting back spending in order to boost growth, which is just, it's total anti-economics. Like, nobody really believes that anymore. There's been a few papers that claimed it and have been thoroughly discredited. If you put £20 in the pockets of those people most likely to spend, which are, of course, those people on the lowest incomes, that will boost spending in the economy far faster than almost anywhere else you could have put that money. And if you boost spending by families, that creates jobs, it creates wages, it creates profits, and you create the growth that Joe and Annabelle are supposedly talking about. But another economic fundamental here to also point out is this £1 trillion debt that you talked about, Mark, and I think you and I have talked about this a bit in the past as well. That might sound like a really scary number, but it's really important as well that we don't just pluck these numbers out of thin air and talk about them without context, because £1 trillion or £2 trillion is neither here nor there, because it changes hugely across time. The value of the pound changes. What matters is as a proportion of the economy. And the last time that the economy had a shock like it did during COVID was World War II, and public debt grew to 240% of GDP. Right now, we're sitting at a little bit below 100%. Okay, and if you look at America, they have vastly increased the stimulus compared to the UK. Actually, there's a really clear case that we have not done enough. And in the end, the true cost of not doing this will be borne by those people that lose their jobs over the long term, the structural scarring that we see in the economy because we didn't do precisely the things like boosting universal credit, like maintaining furlough for as long as it's needed in order to keep spending, keep jobs growing, and keep wages in people's pockets. Final thought on this, Joe, before we move to our next topic?
Of course, Alfie raises some interesting points there, and I think there has to be more to the idea of sustained growth than simply throwing more of taxpayers' money at the solution. I think unemployment we know is currently hovering around the 5% mark, and a lot of the fallout from the pandemic hasn't really started yet. We know that, but I think it's absolutely vital that the government thinks about how we can cut our employers some slack, and using the tax system to that advantage. I mean, I think simple things like replacing employers' national insurance with a simplified payroll tax would be an infinitely better option than raising it. But also things like extending the hospitality VAT cut would be a huge boon for that industry. And the end results of that would ultimately mean that industries not only survive, but that they can take on more staff. And I think it's that sort of thinking that generates real growth in an economy and gives people looking for work a foot on the ladder.
Whilst we're on the economy, I'd like to ask all of you about a battle that we're told is actually playing out within the cabinet over a proposed rise in national insurance payments in order to cover the cost of social care and also to mop up the billions spent in the course of the pandemic. What do we think about national insurance, ALFIE, as a sort of mechanism by which to raise funds?
This panel than might previously be anticipated. I think national insurance is a poor option for funding this. I do think that government should be funding social care properly. I think that means plugging the gap that we're going to see as a result of rising demand across the next 10 years. That's about £6 to £10 billion a year extra by 2030. I think national insurance is a poor option. That's because it disproportionately falls on younger working individuals and less on older parts of the population who are actually going to benefit disproportionately from care over the next few years. And, you know, what's the reason for that? The reason for that is that you don't pay national insurance unless you're a worker. You don't pay it on your profits. You don't pay it on your, on your capital gains or your dividends. You also pay national insurance per week rather than per year. So if you're on, volatile earnings, you have a spike one month and pay a lot of national insurance, but then not fully benefit from that in future months because it's accrued on a weekly basis. And of course, people over the pension age don't pay national insurance at all. So it's a really weak option, especially when there are other options out there that are far more progressive and can raise the necessary revenue.
ANNABEL, DENHAM, early in the pandemic, the Prime Minister said that we will not do austerity second time round. And ALFIE has argued that actually the austerity experiment failed. So we don't think, do we, that the political will is there to seriously cut public spending, especially when the NHS yesterday reportedly asked the Chancellor for an extra £10 billion a year. The Justice Department need money, the police need money, schools need money. There's no end to it. So where's this money going to come from? Of course, that's not before we've even mentioned social care. So how do we raise the money, if not national insurance or income tax?
Well, it's extremely difficult. And, here we are with a Conservative government that had manifesto pledges that it wouldn't increase income tax, but it did that by the back door by freezing the personal allowance. They also pledged not to increase national insurance. And look where we are and what we're anticipating next week. I mean, obviously, there are two issues here. The first, as you rightly address, is the fact that Boris Johnson is very nervous about the A word, about austerity, the so-called austerity that we had over the 2010s. And reintroducing that. He is a big spending prime minister who, has a penchant for big, grandiose infrastructure projects, and the money for that has got to come from somewhere. But fundamentally, we need to bear in mind, and a Conservative government really shouldn't need reminding, that high taxes deter enterprise, they deter investment, they deter innovation. These are the sorts of things that are going to get our economy going again. And it might be quite difficult to lower taxes at this point, at least politically very difficult. But what we can do is start to strip back the reams and reams of red tape that choke businesses, that make it more difficult for them to take on workers. Why do we have the furlough scheme, still in place when we're trapping people in artificial employment? What we need to do is deregulate employment so that it's easier for businesses to take on more workers, or at least retain the workers that they may have already. At the margin, high taxes discourage people from working as much as they might otherwise do. There is a reason why the US, with a tax to GDP ratio of 27%, has predictive growth of 7.2% this year, while Italy, which takes over 42% of GDP in tax, will only grow at 4.5%. So it might be politically difficult to lower taxes, but that's certainly what I would like to see to allow the economy to recover. But if that is politically unachievable, then the government should certainly be looking to deregulate across whole swathes of our economy and stop restraining businesses and allow them to operate and take on workers and drive our recovery that way.
Steve McCabe, how would Labour raise the money for social care, police, the justice system, the military and the NHS?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I haven't a clue at the moment. It might be possible to give you some sort of answer to that if we had a clue about the state of the economy. All I can tell you is that, you know, I didn't stand outside Downing Street and say I had a ready-made plan for social care, and I didn't omit to mention that part of it included national insurance. I think that what you could reasonably argue is that national insurance is not a very sensible way forward because, for the reasons we've heard earlier, that will hit younger workers and it will hit poorer workers. And if ANNABEL's concerned about a tax and job, presumably it would also apply to employers, and that would be a further impediment to taking people on. I think the only long-term way to address any of these issues is to cut down on the non-essential spending and to grow the economy. And that means that we have to set realistic plans for each of the major public sector areas where we get something in return in terms of productivity for the extra money that goes in. Joe?
I think Steve raises some really interesting points there about cutting out waste. I mean, I think some of the more immediate, the short to the medium term answers lay in making the state more efficient and rooting out savings where possible. I mean, for example, Taxpayers Alliance research looked into the potential of more automation in our healthcare service a couple of years ago. This is the sort of type of things you see abroad where AI and robotics are used for some of the more menial tasks in healthcare. And a move like that would save £5.9 billion a year is what we found. You know, an 8-week investigation that we took last year found £5.6 billion of waste across the public sector, which I think is completely inexcusable when we're now talking about such stark tax rises. So I think that's the sort of radical thinking that we need to be employing when we're thinking about how we can leave taxpayers with more money in their pockets whilst delivering the essential services that they deserve.
Final thoughts on this briefly, if you can, Alfie Sterling, because, I mean, we have, as you mentioned, discussed the national debt in the past, and I'm persuaded by the fact that, as you've pointed out, interest rates are very low. We're almost being paid to borrow money at the moment, and we're not currently seeking investment from the international bond markets. The Bank of England are printing digital money, but this does impair future borrowing for future administrations, doesn't it? If you sort of max out these rather clever hacks by which to generate money, then future generations won't have that mechanism at their disposal. And some think that, yes, interest rates are low at the moment, but inflation is perhaps on its way, and we could be exposed given the level of debt. So do we not have to have a grown-up conversation at some point about when to stop borrowing and start growing?
Yes, in short, actually, but I would decouple the two there a bit. So there's one question which is about how do you support a recovery following a crisis, and that's where you're talking about borrowing, and it's not about hacks and clever wheezes. It's about the fact that you can borrow very efficiently and productively in a crisis in order to make sure you don't have long-term costs for the future. But that's an entirely separate question, actually, I think, to ones around structural changes we want to make as a society to our economy or to our public services, which is what social care is about. You know, we can't indefinitely borrow for increased social care forever. And actually, this is where I think, you know, I disagree with both Steve and Joe, because I think there are really clear tax options for this. You know, the UK is not a high tax country. About 37% of GDP. If you compare that to most of our neighbours, they tax about up north of 40% of GDP. You know, France, Germany, Denmark, Spain even. And actually in the UK, there are some really obvious options. And this is one actually I think, you know, Joe and ANNABEL would really agree with, for example, because it's not high tax that deters growth and entrepreneurship. It is distortion and arbitrary impediment. So, for example, the fact that you pay much higher tax on your remuneration from work if you're PAYE or you're self-employed versus if you own your own company or realise the gains in capital gains. If we equalise those tax, you can raise enough to pay for social care, and that's win-win. You raise the money, you improve your social care for the long term, but you also remove a really destructive distortion in the tax system as well, which benefits the wealthy over the poorest at the moment.
My thanks to Digital Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, Joe VENTRE, also Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation, ALFIE Sterling, Labour MP for Birmingham, Selly and member of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, Steve McCabe, and Head of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, ANNABEL DENHAM. What's your view? Are you worried about the national debt? How do we pay for social care? How do we find money for the NHS, for police, for schools, for the justice system, for the military? You name it. Of course, local authorities are all facing bankruptcy too. So how do we solve this problem? Do we raise taxes? Do we cut spending? Is it time for austerity Mark II? I'd love to know your thoughts.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.